Hey friends, I'm Sharon Betters, and this is the Help and Hope podcast, and it is produced by MARKINC Ministries. Our vision at MARKINC is to offer help and hope, especially to hurting people. And one of the ways that we do that is through this podcast, where we typically share redemption stories, stories from people who are further along in life's journey, who have experienced something really hard, and they're calling back to us with wisdom and God's faithfulness and even direction and comfort and encouragement. Another way that we use this podcast to help people walk by faith is to put tools into the hands of our audience. And that's what we're going to do today. And I am so excited about our guest. Over my lifetime, I have journaled, I have written, I have told stories and to myself and recorded them. And mainly it's been for me, but actually, eventually, it's for my children and my grandchildren, because someday I know that they are going to need those stories of God's faithfulness. And that's why I'm so excited to have with us today Elizabeth Turnage and Kathy Chapel, because both of these women believe that telling stories of God's faithfulness is a way of helping the next generation to turn their hearts toward Jesus. Kathy is a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. She is an author. She co-authored a children's book with her husband, Brian. She also co-authored Each for the Other, a book about marriage with her husband, Brian. And her latest book is called The Great Iowa Road Trip. So I hope I have your attention right there. And then Elizabeth is also a wife, a mother, a new grandmother, which you have just entered into the incredible place that you can't explain until you get there, of love and joy. She is an author, and in fact, she wrote, and I want to get the title right, a best-selling devotional that is called The Waiting Room, 60 Meditations for Finding Peace and Hope. And she also coaches people on how to organize our lives and our legacies. So Elizabeth has been on the Help and Hope podcast before, and in the show notes, we'll have links to those conversations. So Elizabeth and Kathy, welcome to the Help and Hope podcast.
Thank you, Sharon.
Before we jump into our topic, I'd love for you to just share a little bit about your lives, something that you do that gives you great joy or fun, something that's quirky. What kind of coffee do you like? Anything, just to give us a couple brief things about you. Kathy, why don't you go first?
Sure. Things about me, I've always considered myself a musician first. I'm a flute player, I play piano also, and just by default have been a choir director for many, many years. Not currently, but I have been a choir director. When you're married to the pastor and you know how to read music and how to do this, direct, you can become a choir director, I found. So I've loved that. Using my gifts to honor the Lord is an unexplainable joy to me. My favorite kind of coffee in a mug made by Mississippi Mud Pottery in Alton, Illinois. I don't know. To me, coffee is a delivery system for sweetness and cream. So you can serve me any kind of coffee as long as you've got sugar and cream.
That sounds good to me. And I resonate with you as a pastor's wife, being a choir director. I have no training in music except a year of piano and, singing in the choir. But we were in a city church, a little city church, and we didn't have a choir director. And so I ended up being the choir director. And I love it. I did not love it. But like you said, you do what you got to do when you're in the ministry. So, yeah. Right. So Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, as you said, I'm a fairly new grandmother. Our oldest grandchild, all three of our grandbabies were born to three of our four children this past year, and so all in 2022. And our oldest is a little over a year old, and so that has been a great joy, and as you say, just a game changer in the last year and a half. And the other thing that I haven't been talking about very much because I'm so terrible at it, but I started taking golf lessons this year because my husband got very into golf, and I realized that if I really wanted to see him more, he wanted me to. So we've been doing, well, the neat thing about it is you can go out. They now let you start from like 25 yards and then move to 50 yards and then move to 75 yards. So that's been fun for me, and we can go out and do that together. But I just start from, I practice my short game. So that's something kind of unusual and different that's new to me. That's been fun because I get to do it with my husband. And so that's sweet. And I'll go with ice cream. I'm a big ice cream lover. People who know me know that I have my ice cream every night, and I love Ben and Jerry's. These days, Ben and Jerry's Thick Mint is my favorite. So
that sounds really good. So I love ice cream and golf. Many, many years ago, my husband started playing golf, and I just hated it. I mean, I thought if I had 4 hours, 5 hours to do nothing, I was going to read a book. I wasn't going to go out and hit a white ball. But then we started traveling with speaking, and Chuck said, there's some beautiful golf courses. You don't have to play well. It just would be time together. So how could I say no? And so you're smart. You took lessons. I didn't take lessons. My husband taught me. And he always says that was a mistake.
Yes.
Good for you.
But yes, they have this nice little clinic for those of us who are doing this little short thing. And so it's fun. We're all in the same place, and our husbands aren't trying to teach us.
Stick with it. It's wonderful. I'm so glad that I did it. I really am. So, well, Kathy, you have written several books, but the one we want to really talk about today is The Great Iowa Road Trip. So tell us a little bit about how that book came to be.
All right. In 2008, my father passed away. And prior to that time, Dad and Mom had driven from their home in Southern Illinois to far northwest Iowa once a year to go to the Roos family reunion. Here in this area, we call it Roos, but in that area, they call it Roos, which is the original German pronunciation. After Dad passed away, Mom didn't want to go by herself. Year after year. And then in 2012, she started saying, I believe I'm going to go to the Roos family reunion this year, and I'll just drive. Well, she was 85, so we said, no, not a good idea. And she said, well, that's okay, then I'll take my neighbor Ann with me. And Ann is even older. We said, not a good idea. So at the time, I thought I drew the short straw, and it was my turn to take her. It was actually because my siblings had all been there before, and I hadn't. I've long been seen as the family historian. I love to hear the stories. I love to collect the pieces of family history. So I said, okay, I can do that. I can do that, and I'll be happy to do it. It was 2 days up, 2 days back. First 2 days, I thought I might strangle her. I loved her dearly, but she read every road sign out loud. And I'm talking every exit sign, every speed limit sign, and then it's a look over and check my speed. And she also whistled all the time, just constantly this little whistle. So that was 2 days. We went to the reunion. We took 2 days driving back, seeing various sites. And it was during that time that the Lord changed my mind. I'll talk more about that later. But when I got back and I was telling stories to my husband about this trip, and he said, you need to write this down. Because it's not only the story about you and your mom, it's a story about your family. It's a story about your parents. It's a story. Now, that was 2012, and this book was just published this Christmas. Because life existed too. So I would write down everything I remembered about the trip, and then life would intervene. There would be the Christmas program to prepare for. There would be, our child's graduation from high school. And so gradually this product grew. And finally I said, this year, I want to get it in the hands of my children. So I went through the Amazon Kindle process and had it published. So it was a work in progress for many, many years. But that's the background of the trip I took with my mom.
Well, you've mentioned several things that we are going to talk about later, but I hope that Kathy has whet your appetite a little bit when she's talking about her mom whistling and the stop signs and all those things. They're very key in Kathy's story, those little bumps along the way. Kathy, you said that there was a point where your heart started changing toward your mom. And before you start talking about that, I want to say I loved reading your book. There were parts of it that I resonated with because of my own family history. There were times where I teared up as you shared some stories, and I could just really connect on a personal level. So I really enjoyed it. It was beautiful, and I bet your family is loving it as well. But as you started your trip, you said you got the short end of the stick, kind of, and it was kind of with reluctance that you began. But something started changing. Was that a one and done thing, or was there something gradual that happened in your heart that started transforming your thoughts toward your mom?
I think in retrospect, I realized that I started out with my agenda in mind. I mean, yes, I was taking her to her family reunions, my family too, but I was thinking, road trip, time in the car, which I have always enjoyed with my husband and kids. Mm-hmm. And so I had a stack of CDs. I had plans for when we would tune into KMOX radio, when we would turn into NPR, that we would be enjoying the trip in that way. And I didn't realize that she had no interest in that. She would turn off the CD player, reach over and turn it off. In the middle of the news, switch it off and say, let's talk. But she didn't want to actually be the one talking. She actually wanted me to be the one talking. I began to understand that it might be more than I anticipated actually when we arrived at the reunion. I mean, really, that first whole day, I'm embarrassed to express how frustrated I was with her. Then we got to the reunion and I started watching her with her people. And that's what she called them. She would say, these are my people. And I would see resemblance to her face in the faces of her cousins. I would hear this cousin talk the stories that I had heard. I'd never met him before. I'd never met Russ before, but I heard him tell the stories. And I began to understand that I was walking into not just the old black and white photographs that had been passed down to me, but I was actually with my people and going to the cemetery where my grandfather and grandmother are buried. Little rabbit trail. To me, there is something amazing, important that happened to me. I had heard the stories, but being in the cemetery, being with the other family members was proof that these people existed. I know that sounds strange, but when they're just people that you've never met, they're just these black and white photographs. But then to understand these were real people. The aha moment. I mean, so that was a gradual, and I started asking, tell me more about this person. Tell me more about this story. Tell me more about what it was like to visit the farm when you were a child. And she would talk, and I began to appreciate more. But honestly, the aha moment was on day 3. My frustration was still there, not as strong. But when we were driving across Iowa, honestly, there's just nothing to look at in central Iowa. It's just flat. It's just flat. And we came to an intersection that she remembered from other trips, but they had changed it. The road had been upgraded. The interchange had been changed and enlarged. And she pulled out her well-worn map out of the door pocket, and she kept looking around. She said, "This is just wrong. This is not right." I said, "It is right. Look, it's highway, whatever, 39. And she slammed her map back in the door pocket. And she said, "Why do they have to change things? Why can't they leave things the way they are? If they would just leave things alone, I would know where I am."
Mm.
And in the book, the way I wrote it was, suddenly I knew what was going on. Mom wants everything to be the same as she remembers it. This is what Mom wants to do on this trip. She wants to remember. She wants to live in these memories, in the happiness she used to feel, in the joy of parents and husband and family, the way it used to be. And that sounds like a simple thought. Mom likes to be in the memories, but it had never broken through my heart. And I wrote, "In that moment, the Lord broke my stubborn, self-oriented heart, took away my frustration, and gave me a new attitude." The Lord and this is what I wrote this morning, Sharon, as I was preparing, is at another instance, the Lord takes my heart of stone and gives me a heart of flesh. And, I think of that as a one and done, and it is when it comes to salvation. But I think it's a continuing process in my case, that I look back and I look at how self-oriented, if not selfish, my attitude had been. How am I going to enjoy this? What is this going to mean to me? What will I learn? And I had not really processed what it meant to her. And what it meant to her was being back in her memories. And her memories are all good. A husband she loved, parents she loved, a brother she loved.
Yeah.
Children she raised. And in her day-to-day life, in the year that we took that trip, none of those things were true. She had only the memories of those things. She was not living that life anymore. And that's what she wanted this trip to be. And why it took me so long to get with the program. I'm just thankful that the Lord went, "Kathy." So that changed the trip. That changed the entire trip and my understanding of it. And really my understanding of her changed at that point.
And I think that's one of the things that really touched me. At the end of your book, you talk about lessons learned, some of the treasures along the way. And what struck me was your recognition that this wasn't even a choice on your mother's part. It wasn't that you could tell her, "You need to change. You're stuck in the past and you need to get out of the past. And I'm tired of hearing these stories," that kind of thing. This is who she was at that season of her life. And that gave her comfort. Those memories were giving her comfort and a sweet moments in that trip. And my mother was 74 when she died. My mother-in-law was in her 80s. And so my mother did not reach that point of what you have described, but my mother-in-law did. And I wish so much that I'd had your book back then, because it would have given me deep insight into the things about my mother-in-law that were irritating. And yet that is probably who I'm going to be, the very same things I'm going to be. So I really appreciate what you're saying. And I also think what a great example of how God brings things. It's like sandpaper, spiritual sandpaper for our souls, where we think it's about the other person when it's really about our own hearts being transformed and made to be more like Jesus. So, and what a gift you spent time with your mom, to the lessons learned, to be able to live your relationship with her in the context of some of those lessons learned. So one of the things you talked about was the whistling that was irritating to you. But then what did you decide about that whistling?
I realized and continue to realize that music was one of the basic joys of her entire life. Her parents were both singers, not professionally, certainly, but sang all the time. I didn't know until this trip that she said my dad would be singing or whistling through the day. And I did not know that. And but I started thinking about what my childhood life was like. And, my mom was trained, she was a registered nurse. She was trained in that field. But when my older brother was born, then she became a stay-at-home mom. And that was the season. That was the world season of stay-at-home moms in their 1950s button-up house dress with a belt. But she sang all of the time. She sang while she was doing dishes. She sang while she was vacuuming the floor. She would drive us to music lessons, and we sang in the car. And she knew a vast array of music, from hymns to spirituals to these little ditties that who knows where they came from. As she aged and her voice became less pleasing to herself, she kind of took up whistling instead. But I needed to realize that music was a happy place for her. And when she couldn't sing really well anymore, and her fingers were all knobby and arthritic, and I say a number of times in the book, she played hymns every morning and every evening, my entire life until the morning she went to heaven. She played those hymns. Music was where she wanted to live. It was both memories and it was her current joy. So once I got that, I could put up with the whistling. And a little side note that I did not put in the book, but I thought of since then, I probably do the same thing. I mean, we get in the car and Brian puts on, his playlist on his phone, and it comes through the Bluetooth in the car. So it's an entirely different situation. But, whatever the music is, I'm humming along unless I remind myself not to. And like as not, I will be humming the alto part or the tenor part because I enjoy the harmony. And I think, poor Brian, I'm not even doing the melody. I'm the alto part. So apparently Mom passed that down to me.
It sounds like
it's her happy place. And once I realized that, all of a sudden it did not irritate me. It blessed me.
Yeah. Well, Kathy, I want to come back to you in a minute, but I really want to get Elizabeth's take on this. Elizabeth, as I said earlier, we had a conversation on the Help and Hope podcast about organizing our life and our legacies, and we didn't talk about storytelling. And so now we have Kathy here, who has done exactly what you encourage people to do. Why do you think her book is important, and why do you think it's important for us to be intentional about sharing the stories? Is there anything in scripture that you can point to that would say, this is the way, walk in it?
Well, I think really throughout scripture, we're seeing that God has given us this overarching story of grace. Some of us call it redemptive history, but I like story of grace for, lay people sometimes. So we are taught to remember our story of rescue and redemption. And Psalm 78 is one of those that I always go to because it's kind of a crazy psalm. I mean, it starts out with the psalmist saying, listen to my instructions. I'm going to tell you this story, these lessons from our past, and they've been passed down to us, and we need to pass them on. And then he goes on to say, because if you forget them, you'll be like the Ephraimites who turned around and ran in the day of battle, which is like, can you imagine how embarrassing that would be for a warrior? Talk about a story like running you don't see that in all these adventure war movies. You don't see the soldiers turning around and running in the day of battle. But that's what happens when we forget our stories of redemption, and not just, obviously scripture, but what Kathy has done in the book. And I'm with you, Sharon. It's just so, I learned so many things. Sometimes we might think, reading about somebody else's road trip with her mother, well, what does that have to do with me? Well, I mean, first of all, such a great example of being intentional about sharing legacy, about passing along these, doing exactly what Psalm 78 says to do, passing along these stories to the next generation, and learning her mother's story, and thinking about, like, she was so thoughtful as she's talking with us about, what is God doing, even with the things that are a struggle for me. And that's something that all of us can learn from. And especially when we're dealing with aged parents, that there may be struggles. Well, where is God in that struggle? What does God have for me in that struggle? And so I loved that so much. And then, like you, as I was reading and thinking about some of the things that maybe Kathy will tell us more about, I thought, both of my parents are gone now, but it's only now that I'm learning some things that I look back and I say, I wish I could have, like what Kathy just said about the whistling. I wish I could have been empathetic. I think that's the empathy that we need to care for that older generation. I wish I could have gotten inside of their mind and heart and understood, back to what Kathy just talked about, understood what music meant to your mother. And you did that, you got there. And for some of us, it's only later that we get there. And so when we're more intentional about paying attention to the stories that are unfolding, paying attention to our own stories and communicating those to the next generation, then, we have a better chance of that relational connection, and also of that, relational transformation that God is working in our hearts. So that's a lot. I could go on, but I'll pause there.
Well, one of the
things hard. Oh,
go ahead,
sorry.
Kathy. No, go ahead.
I think a hard truth, and I know from what you just said, Elizabeth, I know that you get this. When my parents and their siblings and their cousins were alive and well, I mean, doing well mentally, I was totally busy with my own life, my own kids. It wasn't until my kids were basically grown and Dad died, again, 2008, that my brother and I, we sat around a table with Mom and my siblings and their families. And my brother and I looked at each other and said, oh my, Dad's gone. His two sisters are gone. He didn't have any cousins. Mom's brother's gone. Most of her cousins are gone. Mom is the only one left. It was only then that I started doing the ancestor research online. And even then it was not urgent in my heart to talk to Mom. Now there's no one left, which, my sister jokes with me and says, well, then you can write the novel and there'll be no one around to dispute what you have just said. But it's hard because I think so often we don't realize the urgency until some or all of that next generation up are gone. And now we've lost the stories.
Wow, so true. I remember after my mother died, my father said that I was going to write his story. And I thought, oh, okay. And he started writing down the things that were important to him. And I told him that I would do it. And we never did get it done. And I will always regret that there wasn't an urgency in my own heart. Like you said, busy with other things, knowing I wanted to do it someday, but never sitting down and just listening and recording and getting it. And our family would have loved it to have had that kind of a record. So it's true. Today is the day that we need to understand it. Time is so fleeting. As I think about the three of us, we have a history of faith and a story of God's faithfulness. But what about the person who is not a writer, Elizabeth, you can address this. Somebody who's not a writer, and maybe their story is not one where they can point to grandparents and great-grandparents who were faithful and who were examples of what it means to love Jesus. What would you say to that person?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the person who maybe doesn't have that strong legacy of faith, and because that's very relevant to me. I mean, I became a Christian, but at 15 I did not grow up in a Christian home, so I don't have the kind of story that Kathy is writing about. But as I have explored my story, I mean, what I would tell people is, if you don't, you're like, I don't know that, anybody, I'm the only one in my family who's a Christian, or I don't have that history of faith. That's okay. Because as you begin to explore your story and look for, I would say start with, this podcast is about stories of redemption. Start with stories of redemption and rescue in your life. Where have you been rescued? And you might think it may not be when you became a Christian. You may think of a time, when you were a little child and I had a bad bike accident, which actually played into my story of redemption, but of becoming a Christian. But, you might think of just times where you were rescued, or you were very lonely and there was a neighbor who made you apple pie. That was a novel I read recently. There was kind of a lonely young woman, and her neighbor was very kind, and her neighbor was a Christian. And so as we start to explore our story and look for rescue stories, we'll see, oh, God was working all along. And it is just remarkable. I mean, I could go on with my stories of rescue, whereas I started looking for that. I saw people that he had put in my life. I saw how, because I had a bike accident, this is the quick version. I missed 3 weeks of school. I went back to public school and I was ahead of the class. And my mother said, no more. My mother was very smart. She wanted me to be well educated. So she sent me to the best school she could find, which happened to be a Christian school. So and there I took Bible classes. And so I would just really encourage people who say, oh, I don't have that kind of history. Start looking, start remembering your stories. And to answer the second part of the question, if this isn't about being a writer, writing these stories down, nobody's going to check your grammar. Nobody's going to come after you with a red pen. Just write, because as we write, we see how God is working. And then I'll add to that, if you absolutely no way in the world are you going to write a story down, get out your phone and find that audio recording button and record yourself telling the story. Or most people know how to use the video app on their phone. Video yourself telling the story. And the last thing I say about that to people in our workshops is, and if you are 85 and you're like, I want to tell my story, but I don't know, I have no idea what you're talking about, Elizabeth, with the phone and the audio and the video. Get a millennial, get a younger person. They will know how, and get them to help you do that. So there are lots of different ways if you absolutely refuse to write, but writing can really help us to see more. So
I love what you're saying about look for rescue stories along the way in your life. And it kind of reminds me of a writing project where you sit there with that blank piece of paper and you look at it and look at it and look at it, and then just start writing. And then things start coming that you hadn't even thought about before. So it's well worth it to do what you're talking about, Elizabeth. Last night we had 7 of our grandchildren over. We have 8 grandchildren that we typically would have for overnights, and because of their age group. So we had kind of two groups of grandchildren, older, we used to call them the bigs, the middles, and the littles. And so the middles and the littles are not so middle and little anymore, but they love coming over here, and they were over for dinner. And the last couple of times we've ended up telling stories that they've never heard before about when we were on missionary trips and things like that. And when they leave, one of them said the last time, please write this down for us. And thank you for telling us these stories. So we have no idea. Some children may not care, but others are just hungry, and they can't believe when you're old that you've done those kinds of things. So
that you had adventures. Grandma
actually had adventures, and they were scary, some of them. And anyway, so I think there's a treasure trove of stories. What about the person who says, but I have so many failures in my life? What do you think about them recording those stories as well?
Well, I am all about, I've written so much about telling stories and writing stories. And one of the things that I've written about are telling the whole story. And so, I mean, there are definitely ways to do that and appropriate audiences to do that. I would say at the very least, start with yourself writing those stories or telling those stories, because again, I mean, God is working. We have to remember that in the Bible, it says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so, and we were dead in our sins, and God made us alive. And so it's, one summer we used to do this thing called summer story feasting with this mom's group I had. Mm-hmm. And one summer, and we would give topics and people would write stories ahead of time. And one summer we did stories. One of the topics was stories of humiliation, which I can't believe that we actually did that, but an embarrassing story, a story that, a story of a failure. And it was very helpful and healthy for people to be able to share that story, because often stories of failures or embarrassment or humiliation, they get inside of us and we're so embarrassed. And then the evil one really works on us and shames us even more and accuses us even more. But as we are able to share those stories with safe people, then God is able to bring them into the light and show how he was working, even in the midst of that.
Teacher. I have a thought. Can I have a, so I love it. So the ending of what you just said, Elizabeth, God is working all the time in my heart, in your heart. It's not like these things happen in a vacuum and then life goes on. Whether we know it or not, God is molding and shaping and sanding off the rough edges. The stories of humiliation and failure, I think it's important to know that not only did God work in and through those situations, but he has forgiven the failure. He is forgiven. And I have a talk I give about the file cabinet of mercy. When I'm haunted, and my haunting time is usually about 3:30 a.m. When I'm lying there in bed thinking, why am I awake again? And then, honestly, Satan starts bringing to me, why did you do this? Why did you yell at that son for one bad grade on his report card when everything else was? Why did you? And I remind myself, I picture in my mind a file cabinet labeled mercy. And I gather up those messy, accusing thoughts, and I open the drawer and I cram them in with all the other junk that I've thrown in there, and I close the drawer and I lock it and I hand the key to Jesus. Jesus, the Lord uses everything that occurs to us. He's this excellent storyteller, and the story started in Genesis and the story will end in Revelation. But God knows the plot all along, just like Agatha Christie knew that the bad guy would do this, the detective would do this, and the bad guy would lose. God wins. Things happen along the way. And I am molded by my past. I am molded by all that occurs to me, and the failures and the sin is forgiven. And do I learn from it? Yes. Do I let it plague me and cripple me? No, because Jesus holds the key to that file cabinet.
Amen.
And I think that's you mentioned the word shame a few times, and that's what has just blown my heart when we tell these stories on the Help and Hope podcast, the redemption stories, is the freedom from shame that people have experienced because of forgiveness. What better is there any better story to pass on to the next generation than the freedom that comes through forgiveness? Kathy, you tell a story you share about your grandmother, Alice Hamilton, and I was really taken with her story and how her passion, her heart's desire was stymied by a physical problem, but it didn't stop her from experiencing great joy and actually influencing your family down through the generations. So tell us a little bit about her.
All right. Alice, my grandma Roos, Alice Hamilton Roos, was born in 1895. And so when she was a child in a Christian family, was learning about the Boxer Rebellion and the martyrdom in China of all the missionaries. And that's a very tragic story. I mean, if you Google and read about the history of China around 1900, it's just tragic. She determined as a child that she wanted to become a missionary to China, that the people needed to hear the gospel. And so that was her goal all along. And her family story is hard. Her father died when she was a small child. They were poor, living on the good nature and graces of other family members and neighbors. But she, I don't even know how she saved up the money for it, but she ended up in 1919 going to Biola, now Biola University, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, to train to be a missionary to China. Well, shortly after she got there, she interviewed with the China Inland Mission. And that's the mission group that was sending at that time, 1919. And Grandma had very poor eyesight. I don't know why that would preclude her from being a missionary, but at that point she was told, no mission board will ever send you overseas because of your eyes. Well, that was devastating, but she knew that the Lord had plans for her. So she continued with her studies at Biola. She met and married my grandfather, John Roos, who was training to be a pastor. And that was their life. Grandpa Roos was a Presbyterian minister, first in the old German Synod of the West, and that's another fun story of the Presbyterian Church. Pastored 10 different churches through his life. And then died suddenly of a heart attack in 1953. Grandma never stopped praying for the missionaries in China, praying that the Lord would send the gospel to China, and corresponded by letter, of course, not email then, with a number of missionaries in China. And so my entire childhood, when I would go visit her from the time I was an infant until I got married, she would show me the things about China. She would open her big atlas to the page on China and point out the various provinces and talk about where the missionaries were there and what they were facing and things. And she just never stopped. In the last 2 years of her life, when she was ill and there was some cancer happening and some dementia, she was in her upper 80s at that point, she would say, when I was a missionary to China, this is what we did. Well, she'd never been a missionary to China. She'd never been out of the United States. But her heart was so burdened that it became her memory. And that was very moving to recognize the passion, the devotion for the people of China. And my husband's gone there to teach in China now, 3 different years. I think since I wrote the book, I have learned that I'm going to China with him this summer. Hoo-ha. Well, to Hong Kong. So that's kind of not exactly. But now I have an ending to the story, Sharon, which I don't think I knew when I talked to you a week ago. Maybe I did. So had this Bible study at Perimeter Church here in Atlanta, where we attend now. And at this table, I was the minority, being a white Caucasian, and that was a whole lot of fun. One of the gals at my table grew up in China, in Shanghai. I said, Rachel, tell me your story. And she said she grew up in a non-Christian home. She went to college in Shanghai, came to the United States to get a further degree, came to Atlanta, started going to a Chinese Presbyterian church so that she could talk in her home language. She just wanted fellowship. She didn't want anything about church. But then she said to me, and Miss Kathy, at that church, I met Jesus and I became a Christian. And then she said, and not long ago, my family, my parents came to the United States for the first time to visit me. And I took them to church and they became Christians too. And she said, and now both of us are crying, at the table. And then she said, but listen to this. You told me about your grandma. She said, when my parents went back to Shanghai, they found a church that is 100 years old. Did your grandma pray for that church? I'm sure she's not the only one that did, but I'm certain she did.
Certain.
So it's beautiful, again, in the Lord's big, long story. Grandma, I'm sure, was disappointed not to go to China. I hope she is in heaven, realizing some of the joy of knowing that Rachel is a believer, raising her little daughter to love Jesus, in part because of my grandma's prayers, that the Lord would bring the gospel to the Chinese people, even if they had to come to the United States to meet Jesus. So that was my grandma. She would sit in her rocking chair and tell us stories. We'd play Scrabble and Chinese checkers, and she would tell us stories about being a pastor's wife, about being a fatherless child in Oklahoma. And she would end every story like this. I was never afraid. The Lord has always been faithful to me. This is part of the story that is important to pass along to our family, for those of us who love Jesus, to know the Lord is faithful. I too have never doubted. I have never doubted through thick and thin. And I count that as my foundation stone that Grandma laid when I was little. The Lord has always been faithful.
There's so many takeaways in that story. And I no doubt your grandmother was a prayer warrior, and
she was indeed,
for you and the next generations. And really, she was a missionary in China. Even though she never went there physically, she was definitely a missionary through her prayers. We don't understand how prayer works, but we know that it's a privilege to be part of God's bigger story through prayer, and to see the generations that have been impacted by her prayer is amazing to see. Well, I hate to wrap up our time together. It's been I could sit here and talk with you guys for hours because there's so much I think that we have in common, and so many places we could go with our conversation, but we are going to have to wrap it up. And I would like, Kathy, for you to share with us the story of when your father was dying, because I think, again, there's so many precious truths there to encourage us. And it reminds me a little bit, not totally, but a little bit about when my mother was dying and the love story between my mother and father. So would you share that story with us as we close?
I will. And I have a book in hand because if I start to be all weepy, I want to know what I'm doing. So the dad was diagnosed with lymphoma at Thanksgiving of 2008. And the Lord used that to take him home in just 4 weeks. So he wanted to be at home. So we had hospice care come and set up a bed in the living room of the house he had built with his hands. And we gathered our kids together. There weren't any, and dad and mom's grandchildren, our kids, and their spouses. And one of the things we did was hand him their wedding album, mom and dad's wedding album. And I wrote, he held the dusty album in his lap and turned the pages. Wow, he breathed, what a beautiful bride, what a beautiful wife. And he smiled across the room. Tell us how you first met, when you first noticed Grandma, one of the children said. He looked at the portrait in his lap. It was when she sang that solo. It was at Woodburn Church, and I was there that weekend visiting my folks. She was singing for a special service, singing a solo. She sang that hymn, When Love Shines In. He paused and looked up, looked at her, and then continued gruffly. And when she sang, that was it. My heart was gone. Mom began to sing so softly from her rocking chair across the room. Jesus comes with power to gladden when love shines in. Every life that woe can sadden when love shines in. Dad joined her when she got to the chorus. When love shines in. How the heart is tuned to singing when love shines in. Dad never sang in public, never. But here he was singing out loud with Mom, and we thrilled to hear these two sweethearts, married for 60 years, as they crooned together and smiled at one another with the love and companionship and sweetness that the years, the joy and hardship and family had brought them when love shines in. Joy and peace to others bringing when love shines in. Mm. So
you're right about being a little weepy.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing that story with us. And I think once more, it's an example of the power of story and how we have the privilege of recording our stories as a means of sharing the faithfulness of God. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Kathy, for spending some time with me today. I know that God is going to use this conversation to touch hearts and turn hearts toward Jesus on so many different levels. I thank you for joining us wherever you may be. I hope that you will leave a rating, leave a comment, pass on this message to others who you know are going to be encouraged to share their stories and tell their stories. I'm Sharon Betters, and this is the Help and Hope podcast. And my guest today have been Elizabeth Turnage. You can contact Elizabeth at elizabethturnage.com. Elizabeth has a powerful service to offer to you on helping you to organize your life and legacy. She has classes, she has blogs, she has written materials, she has books. She's amazing. And I highly recommend that you check her out. elizabethturnage.com. Follow the links to organizing your life and legacy. You will not regret it. I've learned so much from Elizabeth myself. And Kathy Chapel, the author of The Great Iowa Road Trip. I recommend this book as well. And we're going to have all this information in the show notes, the conversations that Elizabeth and I have had previously, the links to their books, the links to Elizabeth's website as well.
I have a website
okay.
That is supposed to go live May 11.
Okay.
KathyChapel.com.
And fantastic. That's May 11th is Thursday. Yeah, exciting.
There you are.
We'll check that out, and we will definitely have that in the show notes as well. Thank you, Kathy. Again, I'm Sharon Betters, and this is the Help and Hope podcast. I hope that you will check us out at helpandhopenow.org. Download our free Help and Hope app on any app platform, where we like to say you will have hope in the palm of your hands, as we have loads and loads of free resources designed to turn your heart toward Jesus. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to being with you again.